people think they understand what racism is? Show of hands. Come on, you think you know. I'm not suggesting I know. I just have a couple of definitions that kind of came to me as I thought about. How many people think there are white racists? That there are white racists out there? How many think there are black racists out there? Okay. Now, this is an interesting thing because this becomes important as we begin to define concepts. Now, I do that. I usually define concepts all the way. But one of the things that I do is I try to help people get a picture of what I mean by racism. So tell me how it is. The first category is white racism, then we'll deal with black racism. So white racism. Tell me the ways in which white racism adversely impacts the lives of black people. Just what are the ways that white racism can adversely impact the lives of black people as a group? What are some of those ways? I'm sorry? Power, but how is that defined specifically? Education, okay. I'm sorry? Economically, employment. What else? Housing, what else? Policing. Why are we here today? Healthcare, okay. Now, we can actually kind of grow that list. Now we're going to move over to black racism. Tell me the ways in which black racism adversely impacts the lives of white people as an entire group. Thank you. The reason why you become silent, there's one that always comes up, and that's fear. White people are afraid of black people. They are afraid of us. And it's a very interesting thing because black people know it. We know white people are afraid. But you have to start getting into the psychology. What are you afraid of? Why are you afraid? But it's an interesting dynamic. Now, also you see the difference in what racism is, do you not? Racism implies you have not just prejudice, but the power to do something with that prejudice. Now, I don't like you, not only that, but I'm going to control whether you can get, I may say I hate you. I hate white people. I hate them. It's not going to change you getting that, loan when you go to the bank. I can hate you all the way to the bank. Not going to change. Do you see the difference? That whereas white racism says, not only do I not like you, but I'm going to change the impact of where you can live. I'm going to determine with that racism where your powers are. You following me? And I'm talking about as a group, not an individual, because people said, I remember when my uncle didn't. I'm not talking about your uncle. I'm talking about the whole group. I'm not talking about an incident. That's a difference. But white people are afraid. So let's get into how this fear impacts criminal justice. Because if white people in this room are afraid of black people, guess who else is afraid of black people? Only they have guns. So now let's look at what he said. Simply put, white cops are afraid of black men. We don't talk about it. We pretend it doesn't exist. We claim color blindness. We say white officers treat black men the same way they treat white men, but that's a lie. And here's a big one. In fact, the bigger, the darker the black man, the greater the fear. Any big black men in here? You got a big old bullseye on you, even if you got the suit on. And it's the truth, because statistics bear it out. The African community knows this. Hell, most whites know it. Yet, even though it's essential, if not the defining ingredient in the makeup of police racism, white cops won't admit it to themselves or to others. He goes on to talk about actually learning it in the academy. Norm Stamper, he told on everybody. He had folks indicted. He now lives in a cabin on a mountain somewhere in the San Juan Islands. That's where he lives. Nobody knows where he lives because he knows they're coming after him, and they have. This is a statement from the book also. Race and class discrimination are all too real in every phase of the criminal justice system, from arrest to sentencing. Impoverished black defendants, and this is going to sound familiar to you, are far more likely to wind up on death row than richer middle-class whites, or the 3,000, and of the 3,700 inmates now awaiting execution nationwide, 43% are African American. Black defendants are not accorded the same due process rights as whites. Their cases are not given the same scrutiny and consideration afforded to white defendants. Not now, not ever, not in this country. This is what the man said. It was dismal. But he doesn't believe it's possible in the current system. So what we have to realize is we need to be realistic about that. So what I have to do is teach my sons how to navigate this, do I not? Doesn't matter what I think and, oh, baby, you know, we are the world. No, this is real. You do have a bullseye on you. When you're in the elevator with the only white woman there, and you're the big black man, she's clutching her purse and she's worried. That's a reality. And if you startle her too much, it used to mean you get lynched. Matter of fact, I think she could scream rape now and you'd get taken down.
I don't have any trouble admitting that I'm a racist. I think it's absurd to try to fight with that. I grew up in this society. I was conditioned by it. I think internally in my psyche I have grounded and rooted those attitudes, and I see it in me all the time.
I don't like being a white man, and that's where I still am and working on it, because I know what I've done, what people like me have done.
Part of being white is just not in any way acknowledging what it means to be white.
I have a white skin, and that with that white skin comes along a whole mess of privileges that I have, and I don't ask for them, they just are there.
You have started to break the code of silence a little bit when you start talking about white people and you start talking about this stuff, and you find yourself suddenly all alone.
The family history, as I understand it, was really, people coming to America as a way of searching for a better life and escaping poverty. And it has often seemed to me that also meant escaping their roots, where they came from, that there was a sort of a desire to separate from that and to become something different.
That I have Scotch-Irish ancestry with a little bit of German. I'm European, and I came over 250 years ago.
My ancestors are from England and Germany.
My ancestors are German and Russian and Scottish.
In my father's side, it was Irish, and my mother's side, it was probably English, but I don't know a lot about her side.
I'm French Indian. I guess you'd say I got a little Cajun in me.
Ireland. Ireland. So do you identify as Irish?
No, not really. I identify as an American.
British, Scotch-Irish. Scotch, that's where my ancestors are from, supposedly, but hasn't had any impact on me. Doesn't mean anything.
I think Pilgrims. When I think of where did I come from, I think Pilgrims, but no, but I'm sure somewhere down the line I am.
Because they were Irish, there was a lot of oppression, because they immigrated over from Ireland. So I thought a lot about what that was like for them as Irish people, but I never thought about what it was like for them and when they became white.
Well, you can only be something if there's something else to negate it, so I guess we became white. I guess we're white because there's a bunch of other races to set us off.
So how did English people and German people get turned into white people?
Came to America.
By assimilation, by living. living in the U.S. It's just the smorgasbord, you know.
I have no idea. I honestly have no idea.
Do you know how they got turned into British and Scott people? How those people got turned into white people?
No.
Have you ever thought about that?
I'm not a history buff.
I think culture did that over time. It's like certain words that we use in our language are not our words, they're other nations, other words that come from other languages.
How did the Irish get turned into white people?
That's a good question.
I think a lot of it was early assimilation in the United States, a lot of European ethnics coming over, assimilating for a variety of reasons. The primary one being a desire to elevate their socioeconomic status. So to get jobs, to find places to live, a lot of the Europeans altered their last names to sound more mainstream. A lot of them changed the clothing that they wore, the foods they ate. So there was this, some might call it assimilation. I think of it more as Anglo-conformity, conforming to this kind of dominant white culture.
But the reality is that those persons who are white and who are considered white and treated as such in this society, by virtue of being white and treated that way, have had to give up who they really were. If they were Russian American, my father's side of the family, grandfather's side, great-grandfather came here from Russia in 1910. He had to give up what it meant to be a Jew, a Russian Jew from Eastern Europe, to become an American, which really meant to become white. The Irish had to do the same thing. The Italians had to do the same thing. The Greeks had to do the same thing. All these European ethnics who were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants had to give up their actual identities for the sake of whiteness.
I really didn't think about being white, I'd say, growing up, because mainly I think because I was part of the majority and I maybe wasn't forced to think about it.
I don't think it means anything. It's just, some people might think it means better, but to me it doesn't mean anything but just the color of my skin, really.
How often do you think about being white?
Not very often. I really don't think about it a lot at all.
Hardly ever. It's just me.
Racially, do you see yourself as a white person?
No, I see myself as a person.
So do you ever think about being a white person?
No.
Probably not very often.
Not really. Sometimes I got a lot of black friends. Sometimes we make jokes about it and everything, but
not really. It doesn't matter to me whether I'm white, pink, or purple, or black. I don't care.
It depends on the social situation. Sometimes I'll be the only white person in the room when it's reversed, when the tables are sort of flipped.
How do you identify racially? Do you see yourself as a white man?
I think that everybody is equal in the eyes of the Lord.
So you don't see yourself as a white person?
Not as much as most people. I think when it's all said and done, we're equal, and definitely inside and outside.
But I don't know if I ever considered myself white or thought about it. At one point I'm sure I did, but I don't really have any recollection of when it was, which I think is a total reflection of whiteness, of never having to sort of contemplate why people treat you the way they do.
To be white means to be a member of a dominant racial group in a society that I'd consider white supremacist. And to be white in a white supremacist society, not just a racist society, because that's almost too generic, to be white in a white supremacist society is to be able to have the luxury of oblivion, to be oblivious to the injustices, to be oblivious to racial privilege, to be oblivious, frankly, to one's own identity. So it is, in a sense, to be invisible to oneself.
Well, I think to be white in this culture means to deny the reality of racism. And it means to deny the privilege that we have as whites. Most people who are whites don't want to accept that they are privileged because they are.
People don't want to talk about being white because they know that at a deep level, even though they haven't some of them may not have ever talked about it with anybody or ever expressed it, they do know that they get a benefit from being white.
if you're white in this country, there's certain advantages that come your way, and it doesn't really matter whether you want to or not, or whether you're in touch with it or not.
Now I know there are privileges that I enjoy simply because I'm white.
Every minute of my life, I'm aware of my white privilege, of the fact that I have a white skin, and that with that white skin comes along a whole mess of privileges that I have, and I don't ask for them, they just are there.
There are things that come to me, that belong to me, that I'm given and that I expect just because I'm white, that I never wonder about, ask about, discuss. And that's the power of it, is that the privilege of expecting that I'm going to go to good schools and that I'm going to have choices no matter what, that there will always be a choice that will be probably pretty reasonable, that will work out pretty well for me.
To me, it's about privilege. A lot of people get to walk around thinking that we live in a meritocracy and thinking that their own hard work is the only thing that's, responsible for their achievements. I think that it means, it has, and I think that it shapes everything.
White privilege is probably the freedom to move through the world fearlessly in a way that black people cannot move through the world. That you can take advantage of opportunities with much less fear and an assumption that you'll be treated equally with all other white people.
Part of it is not having to even think about it. And so in a way, it's sort of like the privilege of having that space in your mind free to think about other things and be concerned about other things. So it's not even having to think about race is part of the privilege.
White privilege is being able to walk into a department store and not be followed by the detective.
A friend of mine who's Asian American, she was very unfairly treated at a department store. She was at a cosmetics counter, and she had bought something and it came with a free gift. So the woman at the counter put the free gift in the bag, and my friend didn't know that the free gift had already been put in the bag, so she had grabbed the one on the counter and put it in the bag unknowingly. Just as the sweetest woman, wouldn't hurt a fly. Just and they called the cops on her, and she was taken to jail and arrested. I put myself in the same position that she was at, and I know there's no way I would have been arrested. I know I would not have been arrested.
It's the assumption that when you go to buy a car that you're going to have the money. Or it's the assumption that when you go into a real estate office looking for a place to rent, unless you wear raggedy clothes, it's that you're going to want to go into this nice neighborhood.
You basically get to say what you want to, be any way you want to. You get privilege. You don't have to work as hard. You can slack off in jobs and still get promoted and still not have to worry about somebody coming after you. So whiteness to me is about privilege and access to information systems and people and power that you didn't earn.
I went through a time where I was poor and I had to take care of my father, and I worked with about 100 African American men, and I was the only white male on the shop floor. And I was really horrible at this job. It was a metal grinder. I'd grind too much of it. I'd make big indentations. I was constantly messing up, and I was sure I was going to get fired. It was just a matter of time. And about 6 months into the job, the boss and a few of the managers come over. They're all white men. And I thought, this is it. This is the day I'm getting fired. And they came over and told me that they've had their eye on me and they think that I'm management material. I said, what? And they said, yeah, you stick around for a while and we think you've got potential to be a manager here.
It's all embedded in every piece of our country. It's embedded in every structure that we have. It's embedded in our economics. It's embedded everywhere.
When I walk into a bank, or when I walk into anybody's neighborhood, or when I walk into anybody's store, that I'm acceptable, that I can go anywhere I want, and I'm seen as an acceptable person. And the reason I am acceptable is because I'm white.
I remember when I was going to get my driver's license renewed for the first time. I really couldn't see very much without glasses. I didn't have any glasses with me. They had you go to one of these machines you look in and see like what letter it is and etc. I couldn't see any of it. I was one of the few white people there, and the guy behind the desk was this older white guy, and he just said, "Oh, don't worry about it, go ahead." I was like, is he just letting everybody through? And I saw that he wasn't, and I kind of was like, oh, okay.
It's the ability to walk into the bank in Savannah when we were ready to build our house and borrow $100,000, and neither one of us were working. I mean, that to me, that is just so incredible that we could do that. I mean, of course we had to present, we had to give them facts and figures and all that kind of thing, but if you were a person of color and you walked in and you said, well, we're neither working and they're going to loan you $100,000, I don't think so.
Oh, simple things. I mean, from everything from the ease of getting a bank loan to knowing that I can drive just about anywhere in the city and not get stopped because of my color by the police.
When I drive down the road and I get pulled over by a police officer, it's probably because either I've broken the law or I'm getting a flat tire and the police officer's going to tell me I'm getting a flat tire.
Well, when I get pulled over, I don't get tickets, I'm a white woman, middle class, in a minivan. I get pulled over all the time for speeding. And it's almost become a joke. And then, the police officers apologized to me for pulling me over, and I know if I was a person of color, that wouldn't happen, I know that I would be pulled over a lot more if I was a person of color because I speed every day. And so I get stopped, they look at my license, and then they let me go,
I've experienced whiteness on the 3 occasions that I've been pulled over by law enforcement driving a car. One time I ran a red light, it was turning red, right? Another time I was speeding, and another time I had a headlight out. And every single time I got off with a warning. I never got a ticket for any of those things. It was privilege and whiteness, therefore, that helped get me off. And I think for the average person, it would be whiteness that would allow me not to even have to think about why. I could get away and thinking, oh, I sweet-talked my way out of that. I did, but I was aided by the fact that I'm white.
They're not going to do a body check on me. They're not going to rip my car apart looking for a reason to haul me in. I'm not profiled. That's white privilege.
Basically, when I go to City Council or County Commission, I expect my representatives to take me seriously. And they do, for the most part, because they know that they have to be more accountable to the white community because the white community has more power and money and can vote them out of office.
We as white people have a sense of what our rights are, that we have the right to, live well, live safely, have health care and police that respond to us, have city officials that pay attention to us, have the needs of our community, be able to have those met. And I think that if you talk to people of color or look at communities of color, that does not exist for people. That idea of those rights.
The more I know, the more it's like, I've really got to talk about privilege here, Even though, I faced a lot of shit in my life. I really had all this stuff happen, but I still had whiteness in a way that's given me all this stuff.
And it's all these things which not only give you privilege in the sense of stuff and access to stuff, but also it validates who you are. So you have this feeling that, I'm important, I'm worthwhile, that other people don't have. They have to get it somewhere else. They might get it from their family or what have you, but I'm going to get it from everyone, with few exceptions.
I was taught that you respected black folk, but not really as human beings, more like cats and dogs and cows. You wouldn't mistreat a cat or a dog in my family, and you wouldn't mistreat a black person.
I don't have any trouble admitting that I'm a racist. I think it's absurd to try to fight with that. I grew up in this society. I was conditioned by it. I think internally in my psyche I have grounded and rooted those attitudes, and I see it in me all the time. I mean, I'm always dealing with it. I don't think that makes me a bad person. You know, I don't think that means that I've grounded in original sin or anything. It just means I've been well indoctrinated. But it does also call me to do something about it.
I consider myself somebody who does racist things and acts on the racism I have within me because of the context of the world in which I grew up and live in.
For me, individually, is to recognize and acknowledge that I have the power of race in me, and that I'm going to be, I don't believe I'll ever have a time when I look at anybody and don't see their racial classification first.
Oh, I hate to admit it, but I still have thoughts that I'm smarter than some black people just because of skin color. I mean, I'm sorry, but that still crosses my mind.
Stereotypes will pop in my head just like everybody else, you know. When I see somebody, a stereotype will pop up, and then I have to say, no, you know, that's a prejudice.
When I'm in a classroom of students, I'll tend to look at the white students more than I'll look at the black students. And when I realized I was doing that, I was shocked. And I tried immediately to begin to train myself to stop doing that. And it was astonishingly difficult. There was something about a natural tendency to look at white faces in a way that I did not have the same natural tendency to look at black faces. And I think that's a kind of an ingrained, inborn racism, is all I can think of it as.
I remember I was talking with a young man named Sylvester, and he was saying, "You're racist." And I'm going, "I'm not." He's going, "You are." "I'm not." You know, we went back and forth like that for a while. And then I had to go get refreshments, so I said, "Hold on." And I went upstairs, and my mother turned to me, and she said, "Get a grip on yourself. You know, you're a white young girl, you've grown up in the racist society, you're racist, deal with it, move on." But that was, you know, that was an amazing gift that my mother gave me, because it allowed me to turn all of my defensiveness about it into, oh, well, maybe I am.
Racism and prejudice are very different things. And all of us have grown up with prejudices. Some of us have prejudice against people of color, some people have prejudice against white people, and some of us are downright awful about it.
Because so much of the focus is on personal prejudices. That's how I think a large part of the U.S. population analyzes race matters, is between different groups of people.
Well, I think it works the same way. If black people feel that white people can be racist towards them, I don't see any difference between a black person being racist towards a white person.
In high school, the high school I attended was probably 60% black, 40% white, and being white and in a majority black class, I was picked on and teased for that. So.
Sometimes you come across people that feel because of what had happened in the past that we're held responsible. I'm 30 years old. I wasn't around when that was happening.
I know what it feels like to be subjected to anger for something that I personally never did.
If we're in the wrong place sometimes, it's obvious that we're in the wrong place, we're the wrong color to be in that place, you'll hear a comment. You'll hear some things that's not so nice that you would never think that you would hear.
Like what?
You're a little too white to be in this neighborhood.
When I was teaching, I was not privileged because I had to interact with a lot of stereotypes about white people, and I had to deal with them on that level, but I was privileged in the sense that I got the job in the first place.
I think that one of the key things to understand about racism is, like Malcolm X said, racism is like a Cadillac. There's a new model every year, and it's racism is a dynamic social construction, so it's always changing, it's always mutating. So people that say, well, there's no racism anymore. They're referring to racism as it existed in, 1950 or 1920 or 1910.
Racism permeates every aspect of our society, and it's made, a world that we live in that's very unequal.
It isn't what you personally did or did not do. And I think that's such a hard leap for white people to make, is like, it isn't something that I personally did, but it's something I personally have to work against.
It ain't just a matter of who I am as a person or what I think or feel about other people.
I think there's a hierarchy in our country that's based very clearly on skin color and on people's perceptions of what race you're in. And white are at the top and black are at the bottom, and Asian and Native American and people of sort of light brown hue are in the middle, and Latinos are down, and then blacks are at the bottom.
Racism is not simply about how we get along on an individual level, but it has to do with who has institutional and social power.
White people have the political and social power in our society, and that is a given. And if you look at if you pick apart social and political situations, you can see that very clearly. I think it's quite obvious.
Whites get privilege and experience the advantage of being in a system that thinks white is better than folk of color, and so there's all this unearned advantage that's going on all the time.
Particularly in a society like the United States, it's hard to confront racism unless you understand how, if you're racialized as white, you benefit from racism.
Just because I am white and have these privileges, I participate in a racist system. And that doesn't make, that it's not my fault, I can't help it, I'm born to it, and and that's what being white means.
But I do think and assume that white privilege is in fact the kind of racism that you can't avoid.
All I gotta do is sit down and close my eyes and things are gonna just move forward in white interests, and there's a way in which I'm complicit. I collude. I don't say anything. I don't do anything to stop it or challenge it. And in that way, I really do think that's how racism works, and that's a way in which I'm racist. And the difference now is that I don't try and prove to anyone else or even to myself that I'm not racist. I sort of assume that, know that, and get on with doing anti-racist work as best I can.
I believe that the very depth of understanding racism is understanding that process of us becoming white, historically us becoming white, and exactly what does that mean to be white, and how much of our humanity that we've lost. Because I think that the only way that whites can truly regain our humanity that's lost to the degree at which we've bought into white is through doing anti-racism work in anything that we do.
Like a lot of people, you start to learn exactly how messed up our society is in terms of racial disparity, and you realize that you're in the privileged class, and especially for me, being a queer feminist woman, I in no way wanted to identify myself with an oppressor society, an oppressor group, and that was really hard for me.
But calling myself white, that's been hard to actually say I'm a white person. It took longer than me recognizing that I was a white person, you know what I mean? Yeah. To go around and say I'm white.
Yeah. Get comfortable with it.
Right, with that. Like I was aware that I was white, through this whole process, but it's, it's been a process of being able to say all the time, I'm a white feminist.
It's taking the onion and it's unpeeling the onion, of how racism permeates everything around us.
I am white. I am, middle class, English speaking, and seeing that as tools that I can use, and also claiming my identity communally as part of this white community, and seeing that, the work that I need and want to be doing is in the white community.
What we have got to do
is use the power that we have because of the privilege to kind of tear down those things in the system that hurt other people.
For me, I haven't been able to give up white privilege because you can't until the system is eradicated. It's going to be there. But by struggling against it, by fighting against it, by consciously making a decision to turn against it, I can release myself. I can say to myself, you know what, I'm still receiving these benefits and that's horrible, but at least I'm out there doing something about it. And so there's a sense of freedom. There's a sense of being, of really claiming my humanity.
As a white person, I have leverage. It's kind of funny because as a poor person, I never had leverage, but as a white person, I have leverage. And a woman, I didn't have much leverage either. But as a white person, I have leverage among other white people. They don't, they take what I say as being more valid. It doesn't seem self-interested to them.
I mean, I have connections with the judge. I have connections with the guy in the bank. I have connections everywhere with people that have power who can make decisions around policy, you know, procedures, just all kinds of things. So at that level, I can use my influence.
What has been a challenge for me, and where my greatest challenges have been, is on how I can personally use the positions that I'm in to help to change the institutions in ways that make it possible for them to really be allied with communities of color and accountable to communities of color, and where people who come to work in those institutions can begin to come into them without feeling like they have to code switch, or without feeling like they have to put on another persona in order to survive.
There's this whole world out there that I had no idea about. And as far as I can see, people of color, the ones that I have been close to, and the communities that I've been around, have a lot more figured out about how to be human beings than white people do. I think because we're cast as oppressors, we've had to get rid of a lot of pieces of ourselves that are human, and it's deadened us to a lot. I mean, it's deadened our sympathies and our empathies and our heart to other people.
I think that not knowing that you come into this world with all this privilege makes us, you know, doesn't make us good people, in the sense that it doesn't make us, I'll take that back, doesn't make us the people we could be. It takes away from who we really are as true human beings when we start applying when you start benefiting from something that you didn't earn and you don't acknowledge and you don't do something about.
If you're going along with the status quo and you're not doing something to make change, you're part of the problem. And I think a lot of white people don't want to have that discussion. When we pretend that our school systems are okay and that the criminal justice system is okay and media depictions are okay, and we just go along with it, we are part of the problem.
Divide can be traced back to the late 1800s, during what was called by the imperial European powers the scramble for Africa. Colonization was motivated by the European hunger for African resources. The subsequent exploitation of the African people and the uprooting of their spiritual values by Christian missionaries would leave a permanent European stamp on the continent.
The mindset is the barbarians are backward and inferior, and for their own benefit we have to uplift them and civilize them and educate them and so on. The psychology behind it is kind of transparent. I mean, when you've got your boot on someone's neck and you're crushing them, you can't say to yourself, I'm a son of a bitch, and I'm doing it for my own benefit. So what you have to do is figure out some way of saying, I'm doing it for their benefit. And that's a very natural position to take when you're beating somebody with a club.
Britain cut the largest piece of African cake from Cairo to Cape Town, in addition to Nigeria and a few West African regions. It was also the British Empire that in 1894 imposed an arbitrary boundary around the many diverse ethnic groups and kingdoms that would make up Uganda. The southern Bantu-speaking people were given economic, political, and educational advantage. The northern ethnic groups, two in particular, the Acholi and the Langi, were the main recruits for military and police positions. By exploiting linguistic, ethnic, and cultural differences between the peoples of the North and South, Britain's divide and rule policies created a tension between them that helped maintain British rule. The French took an east-west slice of the continent as well as Madagascar. The Belgians took Rwanda, Burundi, and the Congo in what Joseph Conrad called the vilest scramble for loot that ever disfigured the history of human conscience. Slave labor took over 5 million lives. In Rwanda, Belgium entrenched the idea of the Hutu as a workforce and the Tutsi as extenders of Belgian rule. The politicization of these two cultures would profoundly contribute to the genocide of 1994. In Sudan, the British ruled the Arabs in the north and the blacks in the south as separate colonies, only to combine the areas before independence in 1956. The result has been relentless civil war, the Darfur massacres being the latest tragedy. The Portuguese decimated Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau well into the 1970s. The Italians took Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. The Germans added Cameroon and Tanzania and committed the first genocide of the 20th century against the Herero people.
No colonial power is going to succeed unless it's going to play on existing divisions and sharpen them, increase them, exacerbate them. So one of the first questions after the end of colonialism is who belongs and who doesn't? Who was part of the colonial struggle and who betrayed? And this is time to settle scores.
Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong, they are weak, but he is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so.
By 1914, only 2 countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara, including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out 2 vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took the Cameroons and southwest Africa, and on the east coast, Tanganyika. The vast Congo basin fell to King Leopold of the Belgians. Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed. Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884, a congress of the competing governments met in Berlin to settle their disputes. Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck was there. And active behind the scenes was the ambitious Belgian king. He spoke for them all when he said, "I am determined to get my share of this magnificent African cake." Any power that could occupy African soil could effectively claim it. Now the task was to stake out frontiers in utterly uncharted land. Said the French Prime Minister, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." The British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was to say of this period, "We've been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no man's foot has ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where we were." The great game was to get hold of places and positions of advantage over rivals, no matter what irrational frontiers might result. One of the most absurd cases was the magnificent Gambia River. Britain had long held Bathurst, Banjul today, and was determined to keep this river route to the interior. But France, invading from the west coast, enclosed all the territory surrounding the Gambia River in her new colony of Senegal. So the French were naturally eager to obtain the Gambia River. They offered Britain, in exchange, the much larger and richer Ivory Coast. But the British Parliament insisted on keeping the Gambia, thus dividing the peoples of the region. And the result was, and is, a country that is 300 miles long, but never more than 30 miles wide. What the African inhabitants might think of this colonial carve-up was never asked. The European idea, in the words of one British governor, was to seize African territory and then, as much as possible, rule the country as if there were no inhabitants. In fact, European contempt for Africans now reached new depths, and no wonder. For how otherwise than by asserting that Africans were helpless children, lazy savages, could Christian Europe justify taking their countries away from them? Sang their own version of a famous hymn. Onward, Christian soldiers, into heathen lands, prayer books in your pockets, rifles in your hands. Take the happy tidings where trade can be done. Spread the peaceful gospel with the Gatling gun. The European invasions were widely resisted. Conquest was never easy. And sometimes, as these old drawings and photographs testify, conquest led to a ruthless killing that later generations would prefer to forget.
That is not spoken of much. This is the old Red Museum in Dallas, Texas. Until 1966, this building was the Dallas County Courthouse. It is now a historic government building, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places. It is also the spot where, over 100 years ago in 1910, a group of men threw a rope around the neck of an elderly black man accused of sexual assault and tossed the rope out the window where a mob strung him up to an archway. This is a spot where that lynching began. And despite the fact that thousands of these murders took place across the South, it is one of the only spots in the entire country where a lynching that took place is actually marked or even acknowledged. By contrast, there are numerous Civil War memorials across the South, ones honoring the other parts of America's complex racial history. A new report from the Equal Justice Initiative found that between 1877 and 1950, there were nearly 4,000 black victims of racial terror lynchings in 12 southern states. This map illustrates just how pervasive that lynching was, with those orange dots representing premeditated murders carried out by groups of at least 3 people. The report is part of a larger project by the Equal Justice Initiative to erect historical markers and memorials in these lynching spots, a plan meant to help the country reckon with its ugly past, and a plan already met with local resistance. Joining me now is the Executive Director of the Equal Justice Initiative and author of Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption, Brian Stevenson. Brian, thank you so much for joining me. This is such a hugely important project and such a hugely difficult project. The number 4,000 is not, I think, a number any American can fully wrap their head around in terms of the pervasiveness, the scope of these lynchings. And yet this seems to be one of the only full accountings of how we terrorized a certain group of people in this country. How have you learned the ways in which we have reconciled or not reconciled with our bloody past through this project?
Well, no, I think you're absolutely right. We have not spent a lot of time really trying to understand this part of our history, I think in part because it is so difficult and it is so disturbing. But it is essential that we understand this legacy of terror lynchings. We spent an enormous amount of time first reviewing the accumulated data at Tuskegee University and by a couple of researchers, Professor Stuart Tolney and Woody Beck. And then we went into these communities. We've worked in this area for a very long time. We went to historical archives, into museums, into local newspapers, and found additional evidence that allowed us to document several hundred more of these lynchings. And what I try to emphasize is that it's not just the 4,000 people who were murdered, it's all of the African Americans who lived in these states that were threatened and menaced and terrorized by these acts of often tolerated and supported violence.
Yeah, that's one of the most devastating, I mean, aside from the horrific brutality, the fact that these lynchings took place in public, that children often watch them. I'll read an account of one, and I will just say in advance, it is very, very graphic. In 1904, in Doddsville, Mississippi, both victims, a husband and wife, were tied to a tree and forced to hold out their hands while members of the mob methodically chopped off their fingers and distributed them as souvenirs. Next, their ears were cut off. Members of the mob used a large corkscrew to bore holes into the victims' bodies and pull out large chunks of quivering flesh. It's hard to read this. After which, both victims were thrown onto a raging fire and burned. I mean, you talk about having people acknowledge this, putting up markers to say this is where this happened. I can imagine how difficult it is for people to acknowledge that this is a part of our history. And I guess I wonder in your conversations, how do you underscore the importance of that?
Well, I do think it's hard, but I also think it's necessary. I mean, because not only did that grotesque violence take place, but it took place in front of hundreds and sometimes thousands of people who were celebrating that barbarity, who were eating popcorn and cheering, and that is that community. And so I do think we have to talk about what that represents, because the truth is that these lynchings created a narrative of racial difference. It reinforced a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that is assigned to people of color. It terrorized people until they fled. And yet, we mark and monumentalize events going on at the same time that were really behind that. We celebrate the Confederacy. We talk about the good old days of the first part of the 20th century. And I think because we are interested in talking about that era, we have to talk about all aspects of that era. It is true that these incidents were violent and disruptive, but that's part of what we've got to make some peace with, we've got to deal with. And we haven't done that very effectively in this country. And I think our ability to achieve racial justice and improve race relations has been compromised by our failure to do so.
Failure and I would say resistance to acknowledge that this terror, I mean, these were people who were, you know, a black man who knocked on a white woman's door and was lynched for that. I mean, terror is the word to use here, and I think it's really important that we emphasize that these were acts of terror.
Absolutely. I meet many people of color who are offended when they hear newscasters talking on TV about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. And they say to me, Mr. Stevenson, we grew up with terrorism. We grew up with violence. The geography of African Americans in this country was shaped by the menace created by these terror acts. And you're right that they weren't just for people being accused of serious crimes. They were for social transactions. In Blakely, Georgia, World War I black veteran comes back and he's wearing his uniform and he's lynched because he refuses to take off his American Army uniform. A man in Laverne, Alabama, in 1940 doesn't call a police officer with the title Mr. and is lynched for that offense. Running to a train station in Mississippi, a black man is lynched because he bumps into a white woman. And this kind of violence in response to these very minor social transgressions absolutely traumatize people of color.
Chicago, Illinois next. Beverly, line for Democrats. Good morning, Beverly.
Good morning. How you doing?
Good.
Okay, you know, I hear this gentleman sit here and say President Obama won't call these Muslims radical Muslims. Okay.
No, Muslim terrorists. Yeah.
Okay, what do you call Christians when they behead blacks, castrate blacks, throw firebombs in churches, killing innocent children, all because we're black? Why don't you all call Christians radicals?
Actually, you're talking to some guy who has used that phrase. Look, my dad was in the military. We lived in North Carolina when I was growing up. This is in the 50s. And I am fully aware that we had people who were thought of themselves as Christians, who were carrying crosses, burning crosses, who were brutalizing and terrorizing America's black population. And so I agree there are a lot of people who deserve the criticism that you just made, but it's not me.
Let's try to get
James Allen has collected a photographic record of racial violence in the South. For the past 20 years, he's found horrifying pictures in the family albums of ordinary Southern homes. Many are postcards that were mass-produced as souvenirs.
Some of these images were printed in the tens of thousands and sold for a dime or $1 a piece. Some of the postcards tell you where to write and the discounts you'll get if you buy 1, 10, or 100. They were sold in drugstores and pharmacies. They were sold on the street. I purchased a photograph from a woman. The photographer sold them door to door. Her mother bought the image for $2. A murder that is of particular interest to me was of a 17-year-old boy by the name of Jess Washington in Waco, Texas, in 1916. He was seriously mentally challenged. The wife of the farmer that he worked for was found dead. He was arrested. He was brought to trial. The trial took from 10 until 12. And when the jury came back at noon and found him guilty, someone in the courtroom, and it would have been anyone in the courtroom, screamed out, "Get that nigger." And one of the worst and cruelest treatments of a human being began. Jess was kicked down out of the courthouse, down the back steps where a crowd of several hundred was waiting for him. They put a chain on his neck. There were 16,000 people crowding the street to watch this boy be tortured. Jess was tied to the chain over a branch of a tree. The fire was started. They raised Jess from the fire up into the air so that the crowd could see him. There were cheers, like at a football game, cheering the torturers on. When Jess tried to climb up the chains, hand by hand, they cut his fingers off one by one so that all he could do was slap at the chain. They lowered him back down in the fire. A man came up and castrated him. Another man kept a pole so that he couldn't crawl out of the fire. And time and again, they pulled him up to keep him from dying so that the crowd could be satisfied, until he finally died.
rare look inside the secret world of the KKK. For those of you who think burning crosses and hooded rallies are relics of the civil rights era, think again. Hate groups in America have doubled in the past decade, and it may surprise you who's among their ranks and what their agenda is inside the new KKK.
Landsman, left face, forward march.
In a forest grove not far from the nation's capital,
For God, for country,
a group of men and women gather.
for race, for clan, for clan.
As the light fades, they enact a ritual over a century old, but as fresh and searing as the flame they ignite.
Klansman, the fiery cross.
A cross on fire. They are known as the Invisible Empire for a reason. They thrive in secrecy, almost never permitting outsiders access. Who are they?
I could be your neighbor. You don't know who I am. You could think the world of me, but yet, if you see me in this hood and knew who I were, your whole thoughts could change.
I've been a fireman. I've been in the Navy.
The people wearing these robes walk among us.
If you want to be in the Klan, fight for the Klan. I fight for it 7 days a week.
Witness the Ku Klux Klan this summer
White power!
in Martinsville, Virginia.
White power! White power!
And in Tupelo, Mississippi, a couple of weeks ago, a similar scene. Over the past 4 months, Nightline has been granted rare access to the resurgent Klan. Their rituals, their people, their message of racial segregation.
If we do not protect our race and protect our people, they're going to destroy us. They're going to kill us.
To get to the heart of it, we headed south to meet the Grand Dragon of the Mississippi White Knights of the KKK. The Clavin made infamous in the film Mississippi Burning.
You already been told once, Nick.
It's impossible not to think of what once happened here. The territory scarred by the battles of the civil rights era.
A Klan bomb ripped apart Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 children attending Bible class.
So we're in Birmingham, Alabama. And just down here is the jail where Martin Luther King Jr. wrote the famous letter from a Birmingham jail. Along the way, we make a stop at the Southern Poverty Law Center, where Mark Potok and his colleagues have been fighting the KKK in courtrooms and classrooms for decades. Many of the Klan's people we've talked to say Barack Obama has been our single most effective recruiting tool in the last 4 or 5 years.
Well, I think there's some truth to that. Immediately after Obama was elected, we saw 2 of the largest hate websites in the country crash.
Potok told us that by the late 80s, the Klan had dwindled to a few hundred. They now number closer to 6,000. He believes they can be very dangerous.
It's dangerous not so much because, a whole bunch of Klansmen get together in a room and plan to blow up a federal building or to murder 1,000 people with a bomb. So, it's these kind of lone wolf characters that get frustrated with their leaders, that break away, one day walk out of their house and start shooting.